you. Good evening, and welcome to the FDR Presidential Library. I'm Bill Harris, and I'm very honored to get to say tonight, I'm director of the library here, and this is the first program I've done as the library. So thank you very much. And so, Nick, I'm so glad that considering some of our conversation that you're the first person I get to do a program with in this new formal title. But I'd also like to welcome everyone who is also watching online, as well as who will ultimately be watching on C-SPAN, who are here with us tonight. So this is great that we have an audience and can expand that audience, and happy to have you here tonight. And I'd like to welcome Nick Reynolds.
Thank you.
And I'll give a little overview of him in case you're not familiar or you haven't yet purchased his very interesting and compelling book. He's also previously written Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, and he's worked in intelligence and military history at various times, mostly over the last 40 years. Has a PhD from Oxford, so I can't pull any like intellectual tricks on him or anything like that. And he was in the United States Marine Corps. Later, I found this very interesting. He became an officer in charge of field history, deploying historians around the world. So I think that's really fascinating. I wish we could do a separate program where I could learn more about that. For many years, he was a CIA officer, which of course certainly helps inform this volume. And he was a historian with the CIA Museum too, which that's a whole separate program as well that you probably can't talk about. But
No, actually, I can.
oh, okay, excellent. Then we need to do another one there. And he's taught at the Naval War College and also on the DC campus of Johns Hopkins University. So welcome here, Nick, to talk to us about the book Need to Know. Oh, and real quickly, 2 housekeeping things, and then I'll shut up for a second. We will be taking questions as well when it's time for questions. I'll let everybody know. And there's a microphone right here. And if you would just make your way to that, that makes it possible for everyone at home who may be watching this to also hear you. And then we can just make this all work really smoothly. So, Nick, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, I'm going to ask you a general question for everyone out there. What led you to this topic? I know your background. And what generally, how broad is this so that people understand what your volume's about?
So this book is, in a way, the sort of all of my knowledge is, in a way, in between these 2 covers. My parents were in the World War II generation. They weren't great war heroes, but the war affected their lives. And it was something that would crop up in conversation every so often. And I became curious. So I'm born 5 years after the war, but you absorb that little bit, and maybe sometimes more than a little bit when you hear your parents talking about stresses during the war, and you see relatives coming to the house who were combat veterans. So I was immensely curious about the war, and I stayed curious. I'm still curious now, and so you add to that my career in intelligence, and the 2 kind of come together here in a book about the origins of American intelligence in World War II. And that's, so the book covers mostly 1940 to early 1946, and what I do is follow, I kind of benchmark in 1940, I take a look at what we have then, and then I follow the process of the various parts of American intelligence growing and to a certain extent coming together at the end of the war. So why should you read this book? I get asked that occasionally. And one of the answers is I try and look at the whole picture. So there's a lot of great books about American intelligence in World War II, but each one of them takes a slice of it. So there might be one about code breaking, one about spies, one about commandos, one about catching spies, about the FBI in World War II. And I try and look at a little bit of each of these activities, see how they related to each other, So that's one, I think, that's one of the tasks I set myself. Another task I set myself was to try and tell the stories through the eyes of the participants to the extent possible. So instead of just saying, okay, this is what happened at Pearl Harbor, I try and tell you, here's what Commander so-and-so was doing on that day, and here's how the world looked to him. So in a nutshell, that's what it is.
And I like that aspect. I like any book that also explores history through the eyes of specific people. I think it makes it very compelling, and we're going to get to a couple of those people in a minute. One of whom certainly has a relationship with this library. So more generally, again, what makes people so interested, do you think, in things related to intelligence and espionage and spying? And is that two parts? And does this sort of interest, whatever may drive it, in your view, help or harm the perceptions of the need or the importance of that sort of intelligence?
So why do we care about it? Why do we read about spies and code breakers and whatnot? I've wrestled with that. Why do you sign up to work at CIA? What's so special about that? Part of it is the idea that the people in those professions know what's going on behind the big green door, and they have some kind of inside knowledge. So that, I think that's what drives people to work there, and I think that's kind of that's some of what drives the fascination from the outside. Is like, what are they doing back there? What's really going on? I want to know. So those are, and the second part of your question is how it affects the profession, and is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I know that's a loaded. That's
a really loaded question. I think it's a bad thing if it leads to conspiracy theories. I think it's also a bad thing if the individual organizations themselves don't play by a set of rules. And that's part of the process that you see in this book. When American intelligence starts, there's no real establishment. There's not a federal rule book. Now there's lots of federal rule books, but the point is you want to have some controls over what the people do. You trust these people to manage secrets, but you want some controls and oversight. I'll give a quick example that I like that cropped up in the book. There's a code breaker named Frank Rowlett, and Frank is one of the guys who helped invent the field. So he joins the federal government, Department of the Army, Department of War, actually, and he becomes a code breaker, and he is one of the guys who breaks the Japanese code in the 1930s and early 1940s, which they do with yellow pad and pencil, basically. And he invents gizmos that make American codes and that break Japanese codes. I mean, he goes home after hours and he builds this stuff in his basement. And then around the middle of the war, someone says, "What are Rowlett's clearances?" And people go, "Well, I don't know. They must be the very highest because of what he's doing." Well, they found out he had no clearances because he had come to the field before there were any clearances. So he very quickly got a clearance. But that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. There's you need some process, and this is how I tell the story of how the U.S. struggled a little bit at first to come up with reasonable processes, and I'm a Fed. I'm a retired bureaucrat, and I think bureaucrat is not a bad thing. And I think that's the name of the game, to come up with a process that makes sense for people on the inside and people on the outside, people on the Hill and people in the agencies.
Well, then let's step back to 1939, 1940 in the United States. Now, we've had this notion of espionage or spying. Mata Hari wasn't that many years before, very exotic and very sort of romantic views of things. But war has erupted in Europe. The need for information is ever more important, and information is power, of course. What's the state of affairs in the United States?
So if information is power, we're almost powerless. In 1939, 1940, we have these code breakers like Frank Rowlett. There's Army code breakers and Navy code breakers, and they've done a pretty good job breaking the Japanese code, and that tells President Roosevelt and Secretary Hull what the Japanese negotiating positions are. But that's only a tiny slice of the pie. I mean, there's the rest of the world out there, and we don't really have a way of keeping track of it. So we're really we're really naked. I mean, this is also a time when the U.S. Army is roughly the size. I think it's often said the Army of Portugal and the U.S. Army were the same size in 1939, 1940. I mean, we're tiny, 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 not befitting a world power.
So then let's go right to December 1941 then. We're now plunged into war. It's not something Roosevelt wasn't, in a way, expecting. We had been fearing there would be war, perhaps not commenced in this fashion. But what happens then? We have to gear up for war. Is intelligence having to gear up in the same way, or it had already begun to sort of develop a process?
That's a complicated question to answer.
Good. Take your time.
Because how much time do you all have? So after December 7th, there's an enormous surge, but there's still not a great consensus how and where to surge. So if you look at 9/11, for instance, so the 9/11 attack occurs, there's a bipartisan investigative panel. They hold hearings, they write a book, and they make recommendations. And they do it pretty fast, actually, and it's a surprisingly good book to read. And so nothing like this happens after Pearl Harbor until years later. And so it's not like we sit down and we go, this happened, here's the problem, here's how to fix it. So there are a number of initiatives in different directions, and that's fine with President Roosevelt. So President Roosevelt called himself the juggler, and he was not an organization man. He was not a bureaucrat. He was a supremely gifted politician, and he liked having competing centers of power as opposed to decreeing that there's going to be this super organization that's going to control all intelligence, and here are the rules for everybody, and they have to abide by it. So the question is, the answer is, we progress we advance in various directions at once, and not always in a coordinated way.
Well, speaking of coordination, what about with our allies? What about specifically with the English, with the British?
So the British...
Not the English. Let me make sure
British,
I correct that.
Yeah.
I want to correct that for all of our friends out there. Sorry about that.
I remember the day I said, well, there's two countries here. What's the difference between the English and the British? The British have a reasonably well-organized intelligence structure. And they look over, so this is more 1940, 41, before Pearl Harbor. They look over at the United States and they go, there's not much going on here. The president is not getting the information that he should get, and the various still little parts of American intelligence are not working well with each other. And the Army and the Navy were famous for fighting. I think somebody said something like the Axis was the opposition, the enemy was the other service. The British eventually get tired of this, by the way, and they say, we're tired of having the same conversation separately with the Army codebreakers and then the Navy codebreakers. From this point on, everyone's going to have to sit in the same room. We're only going to say it once. We're not going to say it twice. And so that's a progression that you see during the war, that you go from near chaos, stovepipes, to something like coordination by the end of the war, and especially with the British. By the end of the war, especially in the code-breaking department, there's an impressive amount of collaboration with the British.
Well, that brings us then, you've mentioned President Roosevelt, of course, and Prime Minister Churchill. Let's talk about some personalities. And I'm particularly interested in one, I call it provocative, but it's fascinating to me. And that's made in some of the materials about the book. FDR's approach to intelligence and had been consistently amateurish and reactive. Let's talk about that. Amateurish in what sense and reactive how?
So President Roosevelt took his attitude towards intelligence was that of a politician who needs to know what's going on in the ward next door. So it's really a matter of personalities. He loves stories. He's huge on stories. He loves gossip, even perhaps some mildly salacious gossip, probably not by today's standards, but by the standards of his day. And he thinks of intelligence as building a personal relationship with somebody who can tell him something that's useful to know. So it's not let's start an institution that works, it's let's find people who can help us and let's get together with them occasionally and let's plumb those depths. And so he would have 3 or 4 people supplying intelligence to him rather than have an umbrella organization or even letting them know that that there was somebody else doing the same or an overlapping task. So when he agrees eventually to create a job called Coordinator of Information for William Donovan, and it's really kind of reluctantly that he does that. That's my argument. It's like he does it. He's more or less giving in to pressure to do this rather than buying into a wholesale change in intelligence.
I wonder, too, whether there's some of that political astuteness he has, though, where he appears to be pressured into something that he knows is probably good, but he also knows that there are many people against the idea of something that would be more overarching. And so he sort of allows circumstances to play out politically. I wonder, since he tended to do that with various other issues.
It's on the day he created the Coordinator of Information. So on the one hand, there's a document signed by him that says these powers are going to be given to William Donovan, and his job is going to be to basically to coordinate the information that's flowing into the White House and create products, digestible products for him. And on the other hand, he has a press conference right around the same time, and it's kind of like, well, this is not a big change. Don't worry about it, people. And so he's trying to please all of his constituents, not literal constituents, but the various people, the various power centers, the ones who want a Donovan, the ones who don't want a Donovan. He gives everybody a little something at that point.
Well, speaking of people who could give him information, because he did like information, and he did love a story. Vincent Astor lives right up here and has a home right up here in Rhinebeck. Of course, old Astor connections with the Roosevelt family. So Astor is a source of information for him.
Astor it's a fascinating part of this bigger story. So Astor is not only the neighbor and the man with the heated pool, by the way. When Roosevelt gets polio, Astor says, "Why don't you come over and use my heated pool, and that'll help you," and it did. He's a U.S. Navy Reserve officer. Roosevelt spent, 7 years as Assistant Secretary of the Navy? And so that Navy is the service he loves the most. That's another bond between them. Astor has a bit of a social conscience, so he's not a robber baron. He's not a rich guy who just says, "Hey, we got to keep the bottom line. Nothing else matters." And he loves information, and he loves information that. About foreign affairs, about what's happening overseas. He loves information about social trends. He has a streak that a little bit of the adventurer in him. Roosevelt says very casually, "Why don't you take your yacht, the Nur Mahal," which I think means place of pleasure in Arabic.
Which is quite a ship, really.
Have you seen it? Is it still around?
Well, no.
But pictures.
The photographs.
Anyway,
it's quite a ship.
so why don't you take it into Japanese waters in the Pacific and see what you can see? And Astor says, okay, and sails out there. But he's got common sense. The Japanese go, you can go this far and no further, and if you go any further, bad things are going to happen to you. And so Astor turns around and comes home. But there's this it's what I was talking about earlier. There's this personal relationship between the two. There's information exchange. There's tasking. There's he's like tasking a spy. He's like asking a spy. And there's also not coordination. Like, I mean, you'd think you'd want to call the U.S. Navy and say, hey, I'm asking my friend and neighbor here to do this little bit of collection for me. But as far as I know, that did not occur. And
he probably, thinking of FDR, he probably purposefully didn't want.
Well, yes,
didn't do that.
That's another big Roosevelt trait, is to have personal relations with people who are inside bureaucracies and then circumvent the bureaucracy. So Robert Murphy in World War II is one of those guys. He's an ambassador who works in North Africa, and Roosevelt says, don't bother Secretary Hull with what you're doing. Just report directly to me. I mean, that's if you're a bureaucrat and you believe in good bureaucracy, that's the antithesis of what you want.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's the difference between, perhaps, I've worked in government my entire life. I certainly appreciate a system and how systems work. And if you can you never fully master a system, but if at least you master the quirks of your particular system, you can make it work better. But FDR didn't care anything about really those kinds of, even though he set up massive bureaucracies. The only way into him was that personal route, right?
Yep. He's not a. Yeah, when you consider he's the guy identified with the growth of the federal government, but he himself is not interested in the mechanisms and how the machine works.
So, how does Bill Donovan emerge then suddenly? I call him Bill as if I know him, of course. Where does Bill Donovan spring from?
Well, at least you didn't call him Wild Bill. So Donovan is a New York lawyer. He's originally from Buffalo. He's Catholic. He's Republican, and he goes to Columbia Law School at roughly the same time as Roosevelt. They overlap. I don't know if they're actually the same class, but they overlap. They're familiar with each other, but they're not exactly friends. Donovan runs for governor of New York in 1932. So Roosevelt's the outgoing governor, and Donovan says he runs to replace him. And Mrs. Roosevelt gets out there and campaigns against him and says he's just another heartless Republican. Don't elect him. Stick with the New Deal. There's so many things that separate them, but they have a kind of understanding. And Donovan is proposed, and some of the literature has the friendship being the engine of their relationship. Well, the friendship was more like, I would say they were more like friendly colleagues than they were people who could work together on a friendly basis. It's actually the Republicans in the cabinet who push him forward, Stimson and Knox, who's the Secretary of the Navy, when Roosevelt brings in the kind of sort of national front, what we call a national front in the UK. So Donovan is pushed to the front, and then by his Republican colleagues, and then the British get a scent of Donovan. And when they're looking for someone, I mentioned a few minutes ago that they want American intelligence to be much better than it was, and they figure, well, Donovan's their guy. He's very pro-English. English advisedly here. He likes London. He's an Anglophile, and he gets along pretty well with the English upper class. kind of remarkable considering he's Irish, basically. But at that time, he believed that England was all that stood between us and what's the right word for it? The apocalypse, the pitchforks. I mean, so he's one of the guys who says early on that Hitler is not just another. This isn't just another government. You can't deal with this government rationally. It's an evil thing, and it's going to plunge the continent of Europe into darkness. And if we're not careful, it's going to plunge England and Britain, the British Isles, into darkness. And then where will we be, right? It's not that Hitler's going to come and invade here, but it's that the whole structure, the world as we know it, will no longer exist. So Donovan promotes that idea, and the British like hearing that. And so the British come over. They actually have the cheek to go to Roosevelt and say, "This is the guy you need to pick." And they write memos and they say, "Here's what he ought to be doing." So he's kind of their man. He originally was not into intelligence. Intelligence wasn't his thing. Being a combat leader was his thing. He was only incidentally a lawyer, right? He always seems to be trying to get away from practicing law. He's reasonably good at it. He makes a lot of money at it, but he always wants an adventure, and so the biggest adventure is war for him. So he doesn't want to be an intelligence impresario so much as a combat commander. And in that, there's a big push-pull in the early days when somebody says, "Oh, Bill, you should be the head of American intelligence." And he says, "Well, actually, I really want to command a division in combat." So,
well, that is interesting too, in the sense of these individuals, in this sense of adventure. This idea that intelligence, again, if you're going to participate in it, it isn't necessarily about systems and about organizations. You may be drawn to it for one reason, and yet it has to have systems in order to be truly effective. Is he able to sort of make the transition or become a sort of administrator in a way that is effective? No. It was a loaded question.
No. Donovan's a little bit like Roosevelt in this way. Maybe this is the reason they get along at least on a superficial level quite well. He has something called, his management principle is something he calls the oil slick principle. And he says what it is you hire a bunch of competent people, you set them to work, you don't really tell them what they're supposed to do, right? You say you're generally going to be in charge of this, you're generally going to be in charge of that. And then he says, it's sort of a Darwinistic approach, he says the more competent and imaginative manager his oil slick is going to expand, and it's going to encompass the other ones, and so in the end you'll have a stronger organization. I think even by that test, President Roosevelt was a really orderly guy, and as we just said, he wasn't that orderly a guy. He was the master juggler. I think of all the things he said about himself, that's one of the ones that really, if you're looking at how he ran the country, that fits pretty well, I think.
So Donovan has a big personality. He's got unorthodox organizational viewpoints or approaches. Where are we in 1943 compared to 1941?
So that's a good question. So we come to, Americans are good at surging by and large. So some missteps originally and some confusion, but there's some dramatic improvements in American intelligence as the war goes on, and by 1943, you see especially code breaking has gone from the cottage industry stage to sort of a modern industrial stage, and that's a mix of technology, personnel. Before the war, we're talking tens of people in American code breaking offices. By 1943, we're talking thousands.
That's what's remarkable to me, that the
amazing ramp up, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a big part of it is the female workforce. The ladies are hired to, and put in uniform, to do a lot of the code breaking work. There's a great book by a friend and colleague, Liza Mundy, called Code Girls, and Liza talks about, it's kind of the hidden, up until she wrote that book, it was kind of the hidden dimension of code breaking, and without these employees, most of whom were hired as clericals or junior officers or enlisted, without this solid base, you couldn't have done a lot of the fancy stuff that happened at higher levels. So I mean, we don't want to overstate the case, but there's a high quality workforce that joins code breaking. OSS is in 1943 still a mixed bag, advancing in a few directions at once, and it hasn't quite made up its mind what it can do well. And Donovan, as I suggested, is no help here. He likes this idea, he likes that idea. There's a sort of a palace, there's a revolt in OSS led by some of the career military officers who go, we can't go on like this. We have to be more orderly. We have to decide really what our main product is and pursue that rather than this oil slick approach of having 5 or 10 initiatives at once. So,
well, what were those products? How did it sort itself out into sort of buckets of?
Great question. So OSS is the Office of Strategic Services. So first there was COI, that was the Coordinator of Information, and then after Pearl Harbor, it became the Office of Strategic Services. And did they provide strategic services? Well, the answer is it depends on how you define strategic. One of the things that OSS turned out to do really well was something between tactical intelligence and strategic intelligence. So they were able, after D-Day, to look at the battlefield like 50 miles out, to run spies who could bring that information. It was something the military didn't have. They worked with the French resistance. They had groups called operational groups and Jedburghs, commandos behind the lines, and so they provided a service to the Allied armies as they were advancing in Europe. They did something similar in Asia, but it wasn't exactly a strategic service in the sense of I think of strategy as someone comes to President Roosevelt and said, well, Japan's going to attack in this direction on that day. That would be something strategic, especially if it were the initial attack. Tactical would be, this division is going to move over to that hill tomorrow. So OSS is somewhere in between those two and makes a serious contribution. They're trying to break into the spy business in a strategic sense, especially in Switzerland, but it doesn't quite work out for a number of reasons.
Mm-hmm. So you've got spies, and you have signals intelligence, and you have, I'm going to forget, I used to know these things, your other buckets.
Counterintelligence.
Thank you. How are those interacting so that the decision makers have the ability to determine what an approach would be?
Well,
or to make military decisions based on that.
So I think the answer is you don't necessarily. So the Roosevelt approach is kind of to tell this guy he can work in South America, tell that guy he's going to Europe, that guy he's going to Asia, and so the coordination is not quite perfect. But what you do see is the military high command decides that it likes certain things and insists on getting them, and that is primarily code breaking. And they it's like somebody getting used to a food or a drug or a level of comfort or whatever. Code breaking has delivered some really wonderful things to them by 1943. But in 1940, it was the Japanese diplomatic code, pretty much, period, full stop. Now it's a broad range of information about the enemy, and they really want that to keep coming.
Mm-hmm.
So they're willing to say, well, we know we can't just rely on that. We need these other things. We need the kind of things that OSS might be able to provide, or J. Edgar Hoover, who's catching spies and does a good job of catching. The Germans send spies, poor devils, over in submarines. They put them in inflatable life rafts, kind of thing. They row ashore. They have just these fantastic tasks, like these guys, they land in New Jersey and another one up in Maine, and the Germans have said, well, go find out what the American atomic initiative is. I mean, it's just such a difference between the capabilities and the people and the tasks, and Hoover does a good job of capturing them. But I guess the short answer to your question is the coordination is emerging, but it's not on the level that we would like to see. And code breaking is consistently the appetite among the senior military for code breaking is almost insatiable, and they move to protect code breaking whenever they can. They'll take some risks, but basically they're going to protect code breaking. There's a dramatic story that I tell. Governor Dewey was running for president in 1944 against President Roosevelt, and he got hold of the idea that the Americans had broken the Japanese code before Pearl Harbor. So he was going to argue that the Roosevelt administration was incompetent and should have used this information better to protect the country. So there were a lot of conservative military guys, and they got wind of this, and they said, well, you have to go to President Roosevelt and ask him to ask Governor Dewey not to, for the sake of the country. And General Marshall said, no, let's keep the president out of it. I'll do it. And so he sent a emissary to Governor Dewey and said, please, for the sake of the country and the war effort, don't do this. Governor Dewey was a little suspicious at first, but ultimately he said, okay, I won't do it. I will take this off my agenda. And so, I like to tell this story for a number of reasons. One is that it shows how much Marshall and the military cared about that product, about code breaking. But the other is, Governor Dewey was basically an American patriot. And, he was willing to say the country matters more than whether I'm president or Franklin Roosevelt's president. And the emissary they chose hated the Roosevelts, absolutely hated the Roosevelts. He referred to President Roosevelt as the old con man. He thought Mrs. Roosevelt should be kept out of the public limelight completely. And yet, this guy's name was Carter Clark, and yet Carter Clark discharges this mission to the best of his ability. He could have said something. He was in private with Dewey or maybe one other person, and he could have said, Governor. He could have winked and nodded and said, I really hope. But he didn't. He did. So I like that about these people, that they had the interests of the country at heart, and they did the best they could for it.
Well, that sort of leads to a question I was thinking about as you were speaking. As these systems emerge and more people are involved, so many more, and issues become public or could become public, are there sources of accountability or those who would hold anyone accountable emerging at the same time? Or who's aware who could hold people accountable as an organization grows from the tens to 30,000 people?
So there's, there's like hall talk about what will happen to you if you go to a bar and you talk about code breaking. I think the reality is the system was still very immature, and there was no enforcement was uneven. So if some people could get away with a lot, and others not so much. So one of the stories I tell in here was, so Donovan knows a lot of important secrets. He knows about code breaking. He's not really involved in code breaking, but he knows the basic outlines of American code breaking, and that's a war-winning secret. So the rule basically is, if you have this knowledge, you will not expose yourself to possible capture. And Donovan does this repeatedly. He goes out to D-Day. He goes out to landings in Italy, and in D-Day, by D-Day, so General Marshall, General Eisenhower, the Secretary of the Navy are all aware that Donovan likes to take this risk, and they have sent orders: don't do it. Don't do it. You got that? Is there? And they do it separately. Is there any question about what we are telling you? And he does it anyway. So Churchill did the same thing. Churchill said people with this knowledge will not be allowed to go to the front. And there's a Royal Air Force, senior Royal Air Force officer who does it anyway. He goes one night, he's like at the level of a general, and he goes one night as the second seat in a bomber and gets shot down. And when Churchill's briefed, Churchill says, okay, there's two things you got to do. You rescue him or you kill him. Because D-Day, he knows the secret of D-Day. And so what happens in the American example, Donovan comes home and tells war stories to the president. And the president said, in his defense, he's not aware of this controversy. But the president says, oh, Bill saw D-Day, and here's this wonderful story. So it's the accountability. We still had a lot of things to learn about accountability, is the short answer to your question.
Well, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. If so, line up. If not, I certainly still have some questions, because we only sort of may have, we could keep going.
1,000 pages here. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's not that much.
It's I was going to say it reads like 50 pages because it keeps going. So between 43 and 45, though, there seems to be, and just leaving off 46, and I've not even gotten to, I've got to remember another area related to this. The degree with which it became professionalized, or that it became formalized between that midpoint. I mean, we're only talking a period of 3.5 years here, 4 years.
So I like formalize more than professionalize. Professionalize comes with time. I mean, you don't learn a profession in 3 years. And so one of the things, so even the most experienced guy here only has a couple years of experience, whereas, today, before you become a senior whatever, you might have 10, 20 years of experience. So we still have ways to go before it gets professionalized. But formalized, yes, we're moving towards that by the end of the war. And each one of these players, so there's 3 major camps. There's the Donovan camp, which is human intelligence, special operations, think commandos, and processing information, research and analysis, sort of central intelligence function, small c, small I there. And then you have the code breakers, and then you have J. Edgar Hoover. And as the war is coming towards, there's a general assumption that the war in Europe's going to end 45. And there's a fear that the war in the Pacific might go on until much longer. People don't know about the atomic bomb. There was a saying out in the Pacific, we'll see the Golden Gate in 48. Can you imagine? So anyway, but as the war in Europe is coming to a close, there's this, the people are jockeying, these 3 camps are jockeying for position and saying, we need to continue our activities after the war. And Donovan says you need a central intelligence agency. The code breakers say we Army and Navy and Brits need to collaborate. And then Hoover says, don't worry, folks, I can do it all. So there's a bit of a struggle in Washington, and there's a sincere effort on the part of more the Truman administration, the Roosevelt administration, to sort this out and to start American intelligence off on the right foot after the war.
Well, after the war, things certainly do shift, don't they? And I think of our exhibit currently, FDR's final campaign, where we see him in Yalta, and where the Soviets are already deeply engaged, shall we say, in our business, and with people within our own government at high levels, even within the State Department, what once used to be considered an aspect of orthodoxy that one wouldn't agree with. We now know through after the fall of the Soviet Union that there were in fact Soviets.
Lots.
So that lots. So how are we addressing the internal? How does it also address an internal concern versus when you're fighting a war and you're looking more overtly out for certain military objectives? What happens when you're looking within your own organization?
Well, this is a big part of the answer is after my book ends. So in the late
We're setting
40s,
up volume 2.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
That's right. And so after you get through volume 1, there will be volume 2. So we as a country are not entirely sure what to do with that. It's relatively easy to relatively easy to capture German spies, right? They're sent by a foreign government. They come with a specific task. You can infiltrate them usually because what the Germans do is pick people who've lived in the United States and have an American accent, and some of these guys have
well, a couple were American citizens.
They're torn, so dual nationals,
yeah.
So they're torn, and they turn their guys in. But I don't want to take away from. Hoover does the job. But the more complicated thing is, what do you do when you suspect your own organization has a sieve, right? That there's leaks, and those OSS sadly had. At one count, something like 18 Soviet spies. So the Soviets are supposedly our allies at this point, but we don't. Donovan doesn't really know what to do about that, we kind of stumble at the end of the war, and this issue isn't really brought out until much later on, and it's a subject of enormous controversy. The McCarthy era, where do you draw the line between what a mature organization does to protect itself and people making accusations that aren't always well-founded? So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a ways to go.
It's the question, too, that gets to Hoover in a way, is domestically as well. Is OSS focused solely externally, or is there an internal role?
So that's one of the controversies at the end of the war. Where are we going to draw the line between somebody who catches foreign spies who are targeting the United States and somebody who goes overseas to gather secrets that we need to conduct foreign policy? And these lines blur very fast when you get down to the working level. President Truman says, I don't want a Gestapo. And he doesn't really like Donovan or Hoover that much. And so he says he tries to put mechanisms in. He basically disbands OSS. And parts of it are kept, but Donovan's sent home, the name is taken. And FBI is told, well, your job is to focus on the internal threat and to operate in the United States. Period. Full stop. Is there any part of that you don't understand? So these two presidents are as different as night and day. One of them is, as I said, the juggler, getting all these different parts keeping them in the working with different power centers, and the other is let's have some kind of order here. Let's decide you're going to, Bill's going to do this and Bob's going to do that, and Mary's going to be in charge of this, and we're going to meet once a week. Very, very un-Roosevelt. And I think I personally incline to the Truman approach. President Roosevelt made his approach work, but if you're talking about government 101 or bureaucracy 101, I think the points go to President Truman.
Fascinating. We could have a really fascinating post-war conversation, not at all dealing with your book, about that when I think of the Hoover Commission and other activities which sought to organize government and sometimes over-organized it to the point of ineffectualness. But to an extent, though, how, as the war ended, and we were looking into 1946, and Truman's approach, is it a military question? Is intelligence, OSS activities, are they military? Should military run them, or are they a civilian operation? What is that overlap?
Boy, there's a good question.
That's still a question to some extent, probably, isn't it?
It's a question today. So I happen to believe that if you don't have an intelligence agency and you're a world power, you're in trouble, right? And a lot of the information that you need at the presidential level is not military. It goes to mushy things like what is in the foreign leader's mind, what is his disposition, what is the strength of his economy. So there's a big non-military component to strategic intelligence. But that doesn't really answer your question, because there's also this other part. Do you want to do special operations? Do you want to have commandos parachuting behind the lines and trying to fill in the blanks, trying to kill foreign commanders, trying to start political uprisings, whatever. So the short answer is you can identify the two ends of the spectrum. Military should do this, a civilian intelligence agency should do that, but then in the middle there's this gray area, and I think we're still working to sort out who should do what.
I see we have a question over here. Thanks
Great.
for your patience.
Thank you. I guess I didn't realize how much I really didn't know. So I hope this question has some relevance. But in the intelligence area, was there a role that religious institutions or corporations played? Do you have stories or input on that?
That's a good question. So there's one recent book that I can think of, and it's about people with religious backgrounds who get involved in intelligence in World War II, and the general thrust of the book is that they become disillusioned. So this is individuals rather than religious organizations. So religious individuals rather than religious organizations. I am unaware of American religious organizations getting involved in the war beyond basic patriotic activities. Corporations, so to what extent, corporations just were vital to the war effort, and you look at shipbuilding, for instance. You look at the Kaiser shipbuilding, and under the inspired leadership of Mr. Kaiser, they go from like 692 days to build a ship to, I think the fastest was in 24 hours, right?
I was going to say it was within easily
but that was probably the extreme to establish a
30
record.
days or something was like they could
30
build a ship
days, I think, is
really,
more.
Which
that
is still
was
remarkable.
still remarkable. So, but do we see that same sort of thing in intelligence in World War II? You do. So in OSS, I think not so much, but you do in code breaking, because as the war goes on, they figure out that they can mechanize a lot of this, and so they go to National Register, the cash register people, Do we still have cash registers? Not
NCR,
really anymore. NCR, that's it.
yeah.
So it's data processing. It's I don't know if I think IBM's involved to a limited extent, but it's not really computing. So you do have corporations that assist, but I think you'd have to go to the post-war period to really see a more, a richer kind of collaboration, or one that would spark that would answer your question and make it a PhD thesis as opposed to an undergraduate paper on, a few corporations did this, as opposed to, look, now American intelligence and military are intertwined in this way, and to what extent is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that answer your question? That's a little bit of a ramble, I'm sorry.
Thanks. That sparks, though.
It's a great question.
It is. It sparks a question I see we have another one, but as systems are organized and rules are put in place, the question of morality or how do certain structure or moral structures fit within that in a world of...
Well, yeah, maybe a good answer to your question is we just don't have good answers on what is allowable or what, if somebody, one of the examples I remember was a missionary who was good at the foreign language, so he helped the code breakers. And then he went, well, wait a minute, this information is being used to kill people, and I'm against that. So the system just didn't have an answer for somebody like that, apart from kind of help your country during the war. I think we came up with slightly better answers as time went on.
Yeah, it's still thorny, though.
Yeah.
Another question.
Sorry.
Now, the British broke the Enigma code. Before the war, was the United States working on breaking the Enigma code, or did they wait till after we got into the war and then they worked with the British?
Basically the second part. So we broke Japanese diplomatic code, and that was a different kind of animal from the German codes, and most of the German codes were in some way connected with Enigma. There wasn't just one Enigma, but I mean, that's kind of the iconic bit of technology that they had. And so the Poles made the initial inroads, because the Poles figure, hey, the Germans are coming for us, and we better start now. So in the late 30s, they start making inroads into Enigma, which is really, it's math. It's just remarkable work. And then, of course, poor Poland is overrun, and the Polish code breakers go to France. Then France is overrun, and then the French and Polish code breakers basically migrate to England, and they help the British. They all work together, I should say. So, yeah, the short answer is they work together, and then eventually the Americans come in, get folded into the system. It's a little bit like dating, and initially it's, code breakers are inherently secret people. Code breaking is not going to work if the enemy thinks you've broken the code. So there's a real reluctance initially to share code breaking secrets across the Atlantic, and they take steps. Once where they go out first. They go out for lunch together, and then maybe they think of having dinner together, and so it takes it takes a year or two before they're really comfortable working together. Basically, the second scenario that you proposed is right.
Thank you.
Sure.
How are we in relationship in comparison, let's say, or in contrast to the Germans or the Japanese?
So there's a lot of ways to answer that question. The Germans weren't bad at this stuff. The problem that the Germans had was they didn't have any allies that were peers or near peers. So the Germans tend to say, this is the way it's going to be. And so they don't get the richness of the collaboration that the Americans and the British have. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing what develops in code breaking. So I see one as making tactical, as scoring tactical points every so often, that's the Germans, and the other as making a strategic difference in through their code breaking. So that's the Allies.
Well, I'll come back to that if we get a chance, but I have another question.
Thank you. Just following up on the last question, very interesting discussion. Thank you so much. You may be able to tell I'm British. I'm also English, of course, the latter being a subset of the former, and I think you went to Oxford, so you'll understand me. I'm going to ask a question that may sound very provocative. It's like the title of a thesis or a newspaper headline. How intelligent was the American intelligence? Now, to make that concrete, over your period, World War II, let's take Britain and code breaking as an example. At what stage did American intelligence have the stature of people like Alan Turing and the people who worked at Bletchley Park?
So part of
that may be beyond the war.
Well, no. I mean, I would say if you look at American code breakers like William Friedman and Frank Rowlett and their work on the Japanese codes, they're different from their British counterparts, but they both. I mean, those are both just amazing accomplishments. What British and American code breakers achieved, and their enemies are in total disbelief that anybody could break their codes. So I think you see some pioneers who on both sides who are enormously competent, and brilliant, and accomplish great things. So when does the system? So the British system kind of works. It's like Oxford University, right, or Cambridge University, which is a federation of colleges, and it's a mix of brilliant modern and medieval. I mean, and somehow it works, right? That's how I see British code breaking. American code breaking is in a way a little more straightforward, and we do get to as an institution, American code breaking, I think, hits its stride later in the war and in the post-war. There's one example that I have, I think I included it in the book, where the British counterintelligence has all these dog-eared file cards where they've cross-referenced masses of information. And they tended to do everything in paper, pencil, and pen. Mm-hmm. And the Americans come over and says, a typewriter? Do you ever? No, we don't. And they use these large folios. They use a size of paper that to the Americans is just totally unwieldy. And these pieces of paper are flying around Britain, from the Intercept site to Bletchley and then to London, and the Americans go crazy. But the Americans don't have this. The Americans have this beautiful set of file cabinets at the Pentagon, but it's empty. So what you see is it's slowly, the various systems slowly come together and evolve, and I think you'd find, if you were following the trends, you would find, sometime in a Cold War, in the post-war period, the lines would cross. Does that answer your question? Long answer.
Absolutely.
But,
very good. Thank you. It's
the
amateur versus the professional.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, let's see. We have another question.
I was impressed by your observations about, I think you used the word juggler to sum up how the president and the initial OSS started. And could you give us your opinion or your observation? The world is a different world, much more complicated. But we all know 20 years or so, it appears that there wasn't a juggler. The different agencies were not talking to each other, and that led to real problems for 9/11. is your opinion, all the presidents, they get all the information they can. But wouldn't it be, would Roosevelt be more hands-on in a practical way?
Well, I mean, this is one of the questions I pondered coming up here. So what would President Roosevelt think of what we have now? And I think he would do much the same as he did during the war, and that is he would rely on his own personal abilities. He would circumvent the system, and he would, juggler is his word, not mine. I appropriated it from him, but he called himself the juggler. So I think he would keep juggling and trying to juggle. And the dynamic here is, so do you want jugglers? And he made it work, didn't he? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's basically these are, I think, there's some historians who might criticize him, but I think the overwhelming majority, the consensus is this guy was a really successful wartime leader. So maybe in the post-war period we haven't had jugglers like President Roosevelt, and so if you don't have jugglers, then you should have institutions. So I think the institutions kind of work, but then again I'm biased, and I was part of them, and I think we're trending in the right direction.
Well, I think that there is a post-911 question here, though, too, right? That there were, in spite of efforts to have information be centralized in a way, central intelligence, it still became Navy intelligence, and it still was other, and they weren't necessarily always talking to one another. And then there's this post-911 effort to bring them together again.
So it's like, if you know Goldwater Nichols, that forced the military services to work together. Mm-hmm. And so post 9/11 is kind of like that. Mm-hmm. And so, they don't tell me what they're doing anymore. I have no clearances. But I think we're moving in the right direction. Does that answer your question? So, yes, brilliant jugglers or good institutions.
Yeah, thank you.
Or maybe it's FDR being the consummate politician and in many ways a visionary, saw that institutions, of course, he expands the role of government out of necessity and out of political belief as well. But he knows that's not the only way, that systems work and they're not soulless, that you have to also have personal insight.
Yeah.
And that a balance between an organizational report, which he could have largely cared less about, but someone within that system talking to him about it on a personal level.
So here's what, occasionally these days you see pictures of the intelligence briefers going into the White House and they're briefing the president, and there'll be a guy with a briefcase and they'll have a chart or whatever, and everyone's wearing suits and they're sitting in the Oval Office, and in Roosevelt's day, especially before Pearl Harbor, the briefer might read the transcript of the intercepted Japanese message to him, but it might be while the president was shaving. It might be while the president was still in bed. Or it might be President Roosevelt had sinus problems, and they did a gruesome procedure every week where they packed his nasal cavities with gauze. And that was a time when he said he could receive intelligence. I don't think so, Mr. President. I think you're focused on something else right then. So this was not a guy who he just couldn't absorb or didn't want to absorb the institutional intelligence. He'd rather have somebody like Astor, or there was another guy that wasn't quite in Astor's league called John Franklin Carter. Come down to the White House and let's just the two of us have lunch together and you tell me what's going on.
Or perhaps there's a synthesis of both occurring, and it's it's more obvious when you're in terms of history. It's more obvious even when someone's visiting and you're getting an account versus reports are being read. information is being gleaned in other ways. Perhaps it's a rather masterful synthesis of both.
Maybe, but I think
I'm the director of the FDR Library.
there you go.
I
Yeah,
gotta,
you have to say it.
I gotta go down this road.
So President, you still got, you do have, I guess you could make that argument if you looked at the next level down in the Roosevelt White House, and there's Admiral Leahy. There's a great biography of him. It's called The Second Most Powerful Man in the World. And he is sort of the national security advisor, the chief of staff of the armed forces, you name it. And he's reading this stuff. He's the guy who's going to sit down. Then he's going to walk in and talk to the president and say, hey, this is going to happen next week. This is what we're looking at. And then, of course, you've got Marshall, who's a very cerebral guy who reads and thinks and makes decisions on that basis.
Well, I think we could probably keep going all evening. It's a fascinating topic.
Well, thank you.
It is. There's so many different directions to go with it, and there's so many current connections that we don't even have an opportunity to get into. So, Nick, I'd like to thank you for being here. Yep. His book, Need to Know, as you can see, is fascinating. And you said words at the beginning that you're a bureaucrat and you're not ashamed, and that's not a bad thing. I think I've only heard one other person say that on a level, and that was George H.W. Bush said that a government can only be successful with those who know how government works. So that's the positive spin. But espionage, intelligence is government.
There you go.
And so it has to work, and we have to make it work. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Nick Reynolds.
Thank you.